Hello and welcome to the educational video, Learning About Fiscal Federalism. I'm Carl Narenberg, the writer and producer of this video on behalf of the Forum of Federations, the global network on federalism. In Module 5 of the Forum of Federations series, Learning About Federalism, we tried to answer the question, how do federal countries raise, share, and spend money? In this additional video, we will elaborate on that subject. While it's not necessary to have viewed learning about federalism to benefit from this video, it would be helpful to have a basic understanding of what federalism is and how it works in practice. All governments must finance their activities and pay for services to their citizens. Federal countries must decide how these economic and financial tasks should be shared between and among the different orders of government. That aspect of federal governance is called fiscal federalism because fiscal policy refers to the taxing, borrowing, and spending role of governments. Learning about fiscal federalism is divided into 3 modules. The first provides an overview of the subject and outlines some of the challenges of fiscal policy in federations. The second deals with the question of how expenditures are assigned in federal countries. And the third deals with the raising of revenues and fiscal transfers from one government to other governments.
What is fiscal federalism and what are its challenges? Fiscal federalism describes how federal countries organize government spending, taxes, revenue sharing, borrowing, and economic management. Fiscal rules such as taxing powers are often set out in the Constitution. Federations set out these rules in different ways. There are differences in the degree of detail and actual allocations to different orders of government. In addition to the Constitution's rules, there are also legislative provisions, ad hoc practices, agreements between and among governments, and formal institutions such as the Planning and Finance Commissions in India and the Commonwealth Grants Commission in Australia. However, even when there are clear rules and principles, fiscal policy in federations must confront many challenges. One major challenge is to make sure policies maximize the production of goods and services without waste. This is called economic efficiency. Efficiency issues include internal market distortions and the administrative simplicity of fiscal arrangements. Another challenge is equity or fairness. This includes equity between the federal and constituent unit orders of government, which is called vertical equity, and equity among constituent unit governments, which is called horizontal equity. In addition, there is the important question of equity among the citizens throughout the country.
Efficiency and equity can be perceived to be in conflict or in harmony. There's one view that equity undermines rewards for individuals' hard work and therefore the efficient operation of a state's economy. Then there is another view that the equitable provision of education, healthcare, and infrastructure can build wealth and is thus efficient.
Another major challenge for fiscal policy in federal countries is finding a reasonable match between spending responsibilities and revenues or revenue collecting powers. With that, there is the related challenge of providing predictability and stability in revenues. These challenges are especially acute for constituent unit governments that have limited access to broad tax bases or debt markets and depend on federal support.
Finally, fiscal federal systems face the challenge of assuring accountability for funds transferred from the federal to the constituent unit governments. To whom should the constituent unit governments be accountable for these funds? To the federal government, to their own publics, or to both? As we examine some of the specific practices of fiscal federalism, try to bear these significant challenges in mind. In this module, we looked at the questions, what is fiscal federalism and what are its challenges? Before we move on to another module, here's a quiz to help you answer those questions. I will give you a statement, and I want you to think about it for a few seconds and then decide if it is true or false. 1. Fiscal federalism describes how federations organize government spending, taxes, revenue sharing, borrowing, and economic management. Is this statement true or false? The answer to statement number 1 is true. All of these relate to money and the economy and are key concerns of fiscal federalism. 2. Internal market distortions, fiscal advantage going to one or more regions, and the administrative simplicity of fiscal arrangements are challenges to achieving economic efficiency. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 2 is true. All of the items in this statement are challenges to achieving economic efficiency. 3. Achieving equity between the federal and constituent unit governments and among constituent units is not a challenge for fiscal federalism. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 3 is false. Equity is a big challenge for the practice of fiscal federalism. 4. Efficiency and equity are always perceived to be in conflict. Is this statement true or false? Statement number 4 is false. There are different ways of viewing efficiency and equity. They can be perceived to be either in conflict or in harmony.
How do federal countries decide who spends and on what? Spending money is how all countries provide social services, defense and security, transportation services and infrastructure, a legal system, schools and hospitals, and the many other things that governments do. In this module, we'll examine the models of expenditure assignments, the principles of expenditure assignments, and the challenges faced by federal countries regarding expenditure assignments.
Constitutions usually assign the legislative and executive responsibility of governments. Responsibilities for spending normally flow from these. The degree of devolution of expenditure responsibilities to the constituent units is linked to broader practices of federations. Are they centralized, decentralized, or somewhere in between?
The principal models for assigning expenditure responsibilities in federal countries are dualist and integrated. In dualist federations, the federal and constituent unit governments administer their own legislated programs. These countries include the United States, Australia, Mexico, and Brazil. In these dualist federations, there are federal departments throughout the country delivering federal programs, while state or provincial departments deliver constituent unit programs. In integrated federations, the constituent units administer federal laws in specific areas, including, in some cases, healthcare and education. These include Germany, Switzerland, Spain, and South Africa. Many federations have elements of both models. Among them are Canada, Nigeria, India, and Pakistan.
The advantage of the dualist model is that there is a clear separation of spending roles. The integrated model sometimes produces what is called entanglement, where governments can struggle as they seek ways to coordinate their activities. The dualist model, on the other hand, can lead to duplication of expenditures between the orders of government. Or programs of the different orders of government can sometimes actually work at cross purposes. There is no perfect model, and federal countries are always experimenting with ways to make their fiscal systems more effective.
Principles for allocating expenditures for both dualist and integrated federations include giving responsibilities to the order of government whose population benefits from a public good, devolving program administration where there's a strong advantage in getting feedback from the population being served, and providing for some federal role in major programs that redistribute wealth. In most federal countries, expenditure responsibilities follow the constitutional division of powers. Federal governments are often responsible for foreign affairs, international trade, immigration, customs and excise, the postal service, broadcasting, defense, and monetary policy. Constituent unit governments are frequently responsible for primary and secondary education, land use, regional transportation, direct spending on health and social assistance, and natural resources. Shared or concurrent responsibilities often include post-secondary education, the environment, national transportation, and water. There are a number of challenges that fiscal policy must address when assigning expenditure responsibilities. These include weak accountability mechanisms within government and vis-à-vis the public, and a lack of transparency. Over-centralization when the federal government has virtually all the power on fiscal matters, and a lack of cooperation between levels or orders of government.
In a great many federal countries, the task of assigning expenditures is still very much a work in progress. These countries continue to work on ways to improve accountability and cooperation between governments, and to find the right balance between centralization and decentralization. In this module, we looked at the question, how do federal countries decide who spends and on what? Before we move on to the next module, here's a quiz to help you answer that question. 1. The principal models for assigning expenditure responsibilities in federal countries are dualist and integrated. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 1 is true. Dualist and integrated are the two principal models. 2. The advantage of the dualist model is that there is no clear separation of roles. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 2 is false. In the dualist model, there is a clear separation of roles. 3. The dualist model can lead to duplication between the orders of government as they operate side by side. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 3 is true. The dualist model can lead to duplication. 4. A disadvantage of the integrated model is that governments sometimes struggle to coordinate their activities. Is that statement true or false? Statement number 4 is true. Governments sometimes do struggle to coordinate their activities in the integrated model. 5. Which of the following are principles for both dualist and integrated federations? A. Giving responsibilities to the order of government whose population benefits from a public good. B. Devolving program administration where there is a strong advantage in getting feedback from the population being served. C. Providing for some federal role in major programs that redistribute wealth. D. All of the above. The answer to question 5 is all of the above. 6. Which order of government is often responsible for foreign affairs, international trade, immigration, customs and excise, the postal service, broadcasting, defense, and monetary policy? Is it the federal government or the constituent unit governments? The answer to question 6 is the federal government. The constituent unit governments are generally responsible for education, land use, regional transportation, health, and natural resources. 7. Which of the following are considered challenges when assigning expenditure responsibility? A. Weak accountability mechanisms within government and vis-a-vis the public, and a lack of transparency. B. Over-centralization when the federal government has virtually all the power on fiscal matters. C. Lack of cooperation between levels or orders of government. D. None of the above. The answer to number 7 is A, B, and C. Weak accountability, over-centralization, and lack of cooperation are all problems federations must seek to avoid.
How do federal countries collect revenues and manage transfers? Constituent unit, federal, and local governments collect revenues. They do this in a variety of ways and from a number of sources. In many federal countries, transfers from the federal government are also an important source of revenue for the constituent unit governments. The different types of revenue sources include own source revenues, where each order of government has constitutional powers to impose taxes and charge fees, and shared revenues, which could be under the control of the federal government and distributed by formula to other governments. Taxes are a major source of revenue. These include personal income tax, corporate income tax, sales taxes. There are also taxes called royalties on natural resources such as oil and gas. Federal governments raise the largest share of revenues in most federations. For example, in Nigeria, Mexico, Russia, Pakistan, and Malaysia, the federal government raises around 90% or more of the revenues. In Argentina, South Africa, Australia, Belgium, and Brazil, the federal share is between 75 and 85%. In Germany, Austria, Spain, and India, it's 60 to 65%. In the United States, the federal government collects 55%. In Canada, it's 47%. And in Switzerland, it's about 40%. Inevitably, having more than one order of government raising revenues creates some difficulties. These include competition among constituent units for mobile tax bases. People and businesses might choose to move in order to pay lower taxes. Equity of distribution of resources. Some regions might have oil and gas and revenues from them, for instance, while others not. Administrative costs. It could be more costly if many constituent units collect certain kinds of revenues rather than one central government.
Deciding which government gets to tax what can be very contentious in federations. Income tax is lucrative in developed countries, and frequently the federal government dominates that form. There are also various kinds of sales or value-added taxes. These are shared in a number of different ways. Of course, taxes, fees, and royalties are important sources of revenues. However, in many federal countries, revenue sharing and transfers from the federal government are also of vital importance to the constituent units.
In many federations, there are fiscal transfers from the federal government's budget to constituent unit governments. As well, there is often sharing of certain or all federally collected taxes. Tax sharing and transfers can contribute to the general financial requirements of all constituent unit governments. They can reduce disparities among constituent units. As well, tax sharing and transfers can promote federal government policy objectives, in which cases they are usually conditional transfers for such things as health care and social services. Tax sharing and transfers combined account for over 90% of state government finances in Nigeria. They account for just under half of constituent unit finances in Austria, Germany, India, and Australia, and from 13 to 25% in Canada, Switzerland, and the United States. There are both conditional and unconditional transfers. Tax sharing or fiscal transfers, which are for general purpose, are usually unconditional. Constituent units may spend them however they decide. When transfers are to be used for a specific purpose, they are usually conditional. They cannot be used for other purposes, and there are often other restrictions or conditions on their use. There are also what are called formula, as opposed to discretionary transfers. Tax sharing is usually done by established formula. These formulas may be in place for a number of years. In the case of India and Nigeria, it's 5 years.
Tax sharing formulas can be legally entrenched so that the federal government cannot change them during the designated period. In such cases, revenue sharing is transparent and predictable, although actual levels may fluctuate. On the other hand, fiscal transfers are frequently short-term or discretionary. The federal government can implement transfer arrangements for specific programs, such as building infrastructure, for a limited time period. Or the federal government can change the amount transferred for established programs. In the 1990s, the Canadian federal government did this when it reduced transfers to the provinces for health, education, and social services.
Finally, transfers can be capped